What if the oldest stories of North America were never meant to be seen in daylight? What if they were painted not as art, but as warnings, sealed into stone, hidden in chambers where air barely moves and light dissolves into mineral silence? There are images on this continent that do not comfort. They do not celebrate the hunt or the rhythm of seasons. They linger, they disturb, they seem to remember something long before memory itself. And so, before you let your body sink completely into comfort, before your breathing slows and the edges of this world begin to soften, take a moment to like this video and subscribe, but only if you truly enjoy what is unfolding here. And if you feel inclined, share your location and local time in the comments below. There is something strangely beautiful about knowing where in the world these stories are being heard tonight. In the American Southwest, inside what is now called Barrier Canyon, more formally known as Horseshoe Canyon, towering anthropomorphic figures stretch across sandstone walls. Their bodies are elongated, tapering into nothing. Their eyes are hollow, blackened voids. They possess no limbs as we understand them, and yet they dominate the rock face with unsettling authority. These forms belong to what archaeologists have termed the Barrier Canyon style, dated roughly between 2000 BCE and 400 BCE. That timeline alone unsettles assumptions. They predate many of the later Puebloan traditions commonly associated with southwestern rock art. They belong to an era before clear cultural continuity can be traced. When these figures were first systematically documented in the mid-20th century, researchers struggled to classify them. They did not fit neatly into familiar iconographic frameworks. They were neither purely animal nor convincingly human. Some appear draped in patterned robes. Others seem crowned with horned appendages. A few are accompanied by smaller shapes, perhaps animals, perhaps spirits, perhaps something else entirely. Their scale alone is disquieting. Some rise nearly 8 feet high. Why create such forms deep within canyon walls, far from permanent settlements? Why render them without mouths, without hands, without narrative context? In the 1970s, anthropologist David Susek and others proposed shamanistic interpretations, linking the elongated forms to altered states of consciousness. This hypothesis was later echoed in broader rock art studies by scholars like David Lewis Williams, who suggested that certain abstract or distorted human shapes in prehistoric art might reflect neurological patterns experienced during trance. Entoptic phenomena, geometric patterns perceived during altered states, have been identified in various global cave traditions. But here, the figures are not geometric, they are beings, or they appear to be. The rock shelters of Utah are not caves in the deep subterranean sense like those in Europe. They are open alcoves carved by erosion, visible to anyone who knows where to look. Yet something about the placement suggests intention. Many are oriented toward specific horizons. Some align subtly with seasonal light shifts. These details are not speculative fantasies. They have been documented in multiple rock art surveys across the Colorado Plateau. The ancient artists were not merely decorating, they were situating. But situated within what world view? Further south, in present-day Texas, the lower Pecos Canyon lands reveal another body of imagery equally unsettling. Inside White Cheyenne Preserve, a mural stretches more than 26 feet long. Its central figure appears fragmented, disassembled into symbolic components, serpentine shapes, deer, plants. Archaeologist Carolyn Boyd has argued that this mural encodes cosmological narratives of the ancient hunter-gatherers who lived there around 4,000 years ago. Her interpretation suggests mythic journeys between worlds, upper, middle, and lower realms, woven into a single visual tapestry. Yet even within Boyd's careful scholarship, there remains ambiguity. Some of the figures are skeletal, some appear decapitated. One seems pierced by arrows, though not in the straightforward depiction of a hunt. The imagery resists comfort. It refuses simplicity. Carbon dating of organic binders in Pecos River-style paintings has confirmed astonishing antiquity, some over 4,000 years old. This pushes complex symbolic systems deep into North American prehistory, long before agriculture dominated the continent. It complicates earlier narratives that portrayed early inhabitants as culturally simple, but what if complexity itself was interrupted? Climatological studies reveal that the American Southwest underwent significant environmental shifts during the mid-Holocene. Drought cycles intensified, populations moved, cultural expressions transformed. Archaeologists acknowledge discontinuities in material culture, gaps where pottery styles vanish, settlement patterns shift, or ceremonial structures cease. These breaks are usually attributed to ecological stress. Yet whenever knowledge disappears, questions remain. There is no evidence of deliberate erasure in these canyonlands, no burned libraries, no imperial decrees. And yet, this silence feels deliberate. Oral traditions among descendant indigenous communities sometimes reference powerful beings dwelling in stone, spirit presences not meant for casual gaze. Modern tribal representatives have occasionally requested limited access to certain rock art sites, suggesting that these images carry sacred weight. Sacred does not mean sinister, but sacred often means guarded. In northern Mexico, within Cueva de las Monas, small anthropomorphic figures with exaggerated limbs dance across cave walls. Some appear headless, others hold objects that resemble staffs or serpents. Similar motifs appear across vast distances, yet no unbroken cultural thread fully explains their distribution. Migration patterns during the Archaic period were fluid. Exchange networks existed. But why does a certain elongated, almost spectral aesthetic recur? Some researchers have cautiously noted parallels between North American archaic imagery and early South American rock art traditions. These comparisons remain speculative and controversial. They do not suggest a single lost civilization, but they do raise questions about shared symbolic vocabularies that predate clear linguistic divisions. And always, there are the eyes. Large, dark, almond-shaped voids stare outward from sandstone walls. In some cases, pigment analysis reveals multiple layers, earlier paintings overwritten or refreshed. This suggests continuity of site significance over generations. Yet we do not know whether the meaning remained constant. Did later communities understand the original intent, or were they reinterpreting inherited mystery? Rock art specialists emphasize caution. They warn against projecting modern fears onto ancient forms. And yet, even stripped of projection, the images are not benign pastoral scenes. They are charged. They evoke presence. Presence of what? The term disturbing is subjective. It reveals more about the viewer than the artist. But certain reactions are nearly universal. Visitors report feeling watched. They describe a sensation of entering a threshold space. Neurological studies of liminal environments, low light, enclosed spaces, high contrast imagery show measurable shifts in perception. The brain becomes more alert, more imaginative. Perhaps the art was designed to amplify that state. If so, then these cave and canyon paintings were not passive decorations. They were technologies of consciousness. Technologies can be forgotten. Ritual frameworks can collapse. Environmental stress can fracture transmission. And in the absence of continuity, images remain as fossils of thought, visible yet partially mute. The official archaeological narrative speaks of adaptation, migration, transformation. It does not speak of civilizational resets. It does not suggest hidden oversight or deliberate suppression. But history, even in its academic form, is shaped by available evidence. What survives becomes truth. What erodes becomes myth. What if the most disturbing element is not the figures themselves, but the silence around their original voice? Sandstone erodes, pigment flakes, entire panels have vanished under vandalism and time. What was once painted may no longer exist. What we see is only residue, and if residue can unsettle this deeply, what did the complete story look like before wind and forgetting thinned it down to shadows? The canyon holds its breath. The figures remain, they do not explain themselves, they wait. And somewhere between scholarship and silence, between pigment and perception, a question lingers without answer. Were these images attempts to record a world we no longer recognize, or warnings meant for those who would one day forget how to listen? If those towering figures in the canyon were not meant to be understood easily, then perhaps the confusion they provoke is part of their design. The absence of clear narrative, the refusal to offer simple explanation, these qualities feel intentional. Yet what becomes more unsettling is not only what they depict, but how similar disturbances echo thousands of miles away, carved into entirely different stone by entirely different cultures. Along the California coast, inside what is now known as Chumash Painted Cave State Historic Park, vibrant pigments, reds, blacks, whites, coil across the interior ceiling. Unlike the austere, elongated spectres of the Utah Canyonlands, these forms appear geometric, almost rhythmic. Spirals interlock. Radiating lines pulse outward. Shapes overlap in layered complexity. At first glance they seem decorative, but the cave itself alters perception. The space is narrow. The air feels dense. Light enters unevenly, causing patterns to shift subtly as shadows move. Some anthropologists have suggested that these images reflect cosmological maps, star clusters, solar events, celestial cycles observed by the Chumash people. Ethno-historic accounts recorded after European contact describe elaborate sky knowledge and ritual specialists who mediated between worlds. There are references to solar eclipses, to celestial beings descending. In 1999, archaeologist Travis Hudson and others examined potential correlations between painted motifs and known astronomical phenomena, though interpretations remain debated. The evidence is suggestive, not definitive. What complicates matters is the dating. The pigments themselves are difficult to carbon date unless organic binders survive. Estimates vary widely, ranging from several hundred to over 1,000 years old. Some researchers propose that certain layers may be much older, repainted over generations. Layering implies continuity, but continuity does not guarantee unbroken meaning. There is something intimate about these ceilings. They do not confront from towering vertical walls. They hover overhead, they surround, they transform the cave into a chamber of immersion. Neuropsychological studies have noted that spirals and radiating forms frequently appear in entoptic imagery during trance states. David Lewis Williams' framework, originally applied to European Paleolithic caves, has been cautiously extended to North American contexts. The theory does not claim hallucination in a trivial sense. Rather, it suggests that altered states may have been ritualized pathways to perceive spiritual realms. The geometry then would be experiential residue. But if altered consciousness was cultivated deliberately, then these caves were not passive galleries. They were instruments. Further inland in Tennessee, within Mudglyph Cave, explorers in the late 20th century encountered something quieter, yet equally unsettling. Unlike painted walls, this cave preserves glyphs finger-traced into soft mud along its interior passages. Human figures appear alongside rattlesnakes, birds, complex abstract designs. Some are clearly mythic beings described in later Mississippian cosmology, horned serpents, underworld guardians. Archaeologists such as Jan Simek have carefully dated associated materials, placing much of the imagery around 1000 to 1500 CE. That is not prehistoric in the Paleolithic sense, it is relatively recent. And yet, it reveals something profound. These glyphs were created deep in darkness. Absolute darkness. The cave extends hundreds of feet beyond natural light. Torches would have been required. Air would have thinned. Sound would have distorted. To enter was to cross into a sensory threshold. The figures etched there often appear elongated, skeletal, or hybridized. Some seem in motion. Some appear to emerge from the walls themselves. Mississippian cosmology, reconstructed from archaeological and ethno-historic sources, speaks of a layered universe, an upper world, middle world, and watery underworld. Serpents dwell below, birds soar above, humans exist between. The cave, then, becomes symbolic geography. But even within that explanatory frame, something persists. Why depict certain beings in forms that appear fragmented or distorted? Why emphasize liminality, boundary crossing, transformation? When European colonists arrived, much of this symbolic world was misunderstood or dismissed. Missionary records often describe indigenous spiritual imagery as pagan or demonic. Rock art sites were sometimes defaced or repurposed. While there is no grand documented conspiracy to erase North American cave art wholesale, the cultural frameworks that gave them meaning were undeniably disrupted. Languages were suppressed, ceremonies were outlawed, oral transmission fractured under colonial pressure. Loss does not require flames, it requires interruption. Archaeologists today approach these sites with far more sensitivity, often in collaboration with descendant communities. Yet gaps remain. Some sites were looted before proper documentation. Others remain sealed to protect them. Access is restricted not only for preservation but out of respect. Knowledge in certain traditions is not universal, it is entrusted. In New Mexico, at Pinwheel Cave, despite its name being associated with California's central coast, researchers discovered residues of datura, a powerful hallucinogenic plant embedded in the fibrous quids found near painted motifs. Laboratory analysis published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences in 2020 confirmed the presence of atropine and scopolamine. This was not metaphorical trance, it was chemical. The imagery nearby includes a large red pinwheel shape. Some scholars cautiously link the plant's physiological effects, visual distortions, spinning sensations, to the painted form. If so, then the cave walls may represent experiential documentation of altered perception. Not fantasy, not fiction, embodied experience transformed into symbol. But here the question deepens. Altered states can reveal insight. They can also induce fear. Datura in particular is known for unpredictable, often terrifying hallucinations. Why would a culture ritualize such risk? What did they believe could be accessed beyond ordinary sight? Across North America, these caves and canyon shelters share certain qualities. They are liminal spaces. They require intentional approach. They transform sensory perception, and the images they contain often depict beings that blur categories. Human, yet not entirely human, animal, yet not entirely animal. Archaeology tends to interpret through adaptation and symbolism. It resists metaphysical conclusions. That caution is necessary, but interpretation itself is a modern act. It filters ancient intention through contemporary frameworks. What remains untranslatable lingers as disturbance. Some researchers have proposed that rock art functioned as mnemonic devices, visual anchors for oral narratives. Others argue for territorial markers, rites of passage, initiation chambers. None of these explanations cancel the others. They overlap, they coexist. Yet even combined, they do not fully dissolve the sensation that something is being shown which was never meant for casual daylight consumption. The most disquieting possibility is not that these paintings depict monsters. It is that they depict encounters, inner or outer, that ancient observers considered real enough to immortalize in mineral pigment and mud. And if entire cosmologies once unfolded in these spaces guided by torchlight and breath thick with smoke, then what happens when the guiding voices fall silent, when songs cease, when the language that named the beings fades from memory? The figures remain, the pigments persist, the glyphs harden. But interpretation shifts with each generation that approaches them, carrying its own fears, its own scientific tools, its own skepticism. Perhaps the deeper disturbance lies not in what the caves reveal, but in how easily meaning can fragment when transmission falters. And if this fragmentation has happened before, If knowledge has collapsed and reformed in cycles, then how many other chambers exist, sealed, unvisited, waiting, holding images that once explained the world, but now stare outward without translation? What might they still be trying to say to those willing to enter the dark? If meaning can fracture, then perhaps the most unsettling images are those that appear to survive without context at all. Figures severed not only from language, but from landscape. There are caves in North America where the paintings feel less like stories and more like intrusions, as if something pressed through the stone from the other side and left an imprint before retreating into silence. Deep within what is now Alabama, in a limestone system known as Glyph Cave, researchers documented anthropomorphic figures drawn in black pigment along narrow corridors. Some are upright, crowned with radiating lines. Others appear skeletal, their ribs suggested by stark strokes. The cave itself extends in tight winding passages where a single misstep could extinguish a torch. Archaeologists who mapped the site in the late 20th century noted that many of the images are located far beyond natural light, positioned deliberately in darkness that requires effort to reach. Radiocarbon analysis of associated materials suggests usage during the Mississippian period, roughly between 1000 and 1600 CE. This was a time of complex chiefdoms, mound-building societies, intricate trade networks spanning much of the southeastern United States. The people who entered these caves were not isolated wanderers. They were part of structured, symbolically rich civilizations. And yet the figures traced in those corridors feel stripped of hierarchy. There are no visible scenes of ceremony or daily life. Instead, the beings often stand alone, elongated, eyes emphasized, limbs reduced to gestures. Some researchers interpret them as depictions of spirit entities described in southeastern indigenous cosmologies, beings associated with the underworld, with caves, with thresholds between realms. Ethnographic accounts collected centuries later among descendant communities speak of caves as portals to the beneath world, a place of water, serpents, ancestors, and transformative danger. Within that worldview, entering a cave was not exploration, it was negotiation. The images, then, may have been offerings, warnings, invocations. But something in their posture unsettles even this explanation. Several figures appear distorted, heads disproportionate to torsos, spines arched unnaturally. In some cases, the pigment seems applied in haste, as though urgency outweighed aesthetic precision. If this was ritual, it was not decorative ritual. It carried intensity. Across the continent in Missouri, the sandstone overhangs of Picture Cave preserve another set of images dated to roughly the same Mississippian era. Among them are horned serpents, warriors, and birdmen, figures that echo motifs seen on engraved shell gorgets and copper plates excavated from mound sites. The iconography is recognizable within the framework of what scholars term the Southeastern ceremonial complex. These symbols circulated widely, embedded in elite ritual systems. Yet even here, within a more clearly mapped cosmology, there is disquiet. One painted figure appears partially skeletal, as though caught between life and death. Another seems to hold a severed head. The red pigment derived from iron oxide retains a faint intensity even centuries later. When illuminated by torchlight, the forms shift subtly against uneven stone. Archaeologists caution against reading modern horror into ancient symbolism. Dismemberment motifs, they note, can represent transformation, renewal, cosmological cycles. In many mythologies, the breaking apart of a being precedes rebirth. The severed head is not always macabre, it can be sacred, and yet the emotional reaction persists. Why choose caves for such imagery when mound plazas and open-air ceremonial grounds existed? Why embed cosmological narratives in spaces that compress the body, distort sound, and strip away sunlight? Speleologists have documented that deep caves alter human perception measurably. Extended darkness can heighten auditory sensitivity, amplify internal bodily awareness, and induce mild dissociation. Anthropologists have suggested that such physiological effects were not incidental, but integral to ritual experience. The cave was a technology, shaping consciousness through architecture of stone. If so, then these disturbing paintings were not isolated artworks. They were components of immersive rites. But rites toward what end? In the southwest, some archaic panels depict figures pierced by arrows, surrounded by animals, limbs splayed in unnatural symmetry. Certain researchers have proposed that these represent hunting magic or mythic narratives of sacrifice. Others cautiously suggest astronomical alignments, figures corresponding to constellations at particular solstices. These interpretations rely on measured correlations between panel orientation and celestial events, studies conducted with careful documentation. None provide certainty. Certainty is rare in deep time. What remains is pattern. Across diverse regions, Utah, Texas, California, Alabama, Missouri, there occurs a visual vocabulary of hybrid beings, exaggerated eyes, elongated limbs, skeletal overlays, serpentine companions. Cultural continuity cannot be assumed across such vast distances and centuries, and yet the aesthetic resonance is difficult to ignore. Some evolutionary psychologists propose that certain visual features, large eyes, distorted proportions, trigger innate alert responses in the human brain. They capture attention because they deviate from the familiar human template. Perhaps the artists intuitively understood this. Perhaps they intended to evoke heightened awareness. But heightened awareness for what? Environmental records from tree rings and sediment cores reveal that several major drought cycles struck parts of North America during the late prehistoric period. Societies reorganized. Some settlements were abandoned. Oral traditions in multiple indigenous cultures speak of migrations prompted by imbalance, by spiritual or ecological disruption. Archaeology traces the movement of peoples across river valleys and desert basins. When societies shift under stress, ritual intensifies. Anthropological studies across cultures show that uncertainty often drives increased ceremonial activity. Caves, already liminal, could have become focal points during such times. Still, the paintings do not narrate crisis directly. They suggest confrontation with unseen forces, with death, with transformation. There is no evidence of a centralized authority suppressing their meaning. No written records were systematically destroyed. The loss appears gradual. Erosion of language under colonization, the disruption of ceremonial continuity, the silencing of ritual spaces deemed pagan by missionaries. In some documented cases, cave entrances were intentionally sealed during historic periods to protect sacred sites. Protection can resemble concealment, and concealment breeds speculation. Yet speculation need not imply fantasy. It can simply acknowledge that transmission faltered. The figures remain without full translation. Perhaps what unsettles modern observers is not merely their imagery, but the recognition that they once functioned within coherent systems of knowledge, systems largely inaccessible now. Entire cosmologies may have unfolded beneath those ceilings, articulated in songs never written down, in gestures performed by firelight. When the songs stop, the images persist like punctuation marks without sentences. One might ask whether the true disturbance lies in the beings depicted, or in the realization that human civilizations, even sophisticated ones, can fracture so thoroughly that their sacred grammar dissolves within a few centuries. If these caves once mediated between worlds, between living and ancestral, between sky and underworld, then what becomes of such thresholds when belief shifts? Do they close, or do they remain open, waiting for new interpretations? The figures do not fade entirely. They wait in darkness, unchanged by academic debate. And if knowledge can erode quietly over generations without dramatic catastrophe, then how many other layers of understanding have thinned unnoticed? The cave walls do not accuse, they endure, but endurance is not the same as comprehension. And somewhere in the cool limestone corridors beneath pigment and mineral breath, the unanswered question lingers. Were these images remnants of a worldview already dissolving at the time they were painted? Or warnings left by those who sense the approach of forgetting? If forgetting can arrive quietly, then perhaps the most troubling paintings are those that seem to record not presence, but absence. There are chambers in North America where the walls feel less like canvases and more like thresholds, places where something was once negotiated, something now incomplete. In the limestone labyrinths of Kentucky, within what is now protected as Mammoth Cave, archaeologists have documented charcoal drawings along deep passages, some more than 2,000 years old. Unlike the vivid red and black pictographs of the Southwest, these images are stark and monochrome. Torches made of river cane once flickered against damp walls, leaving soot and faint outlines. Human figures appear with outstretched limbs. Serpents coil in elongated arcs. Geometric forms, crosshatches, grids, parallel lines, hover near entrances to narrower corridors. Radiocarbon dating of torch fragments has placed human activity in Mammoth Cave as far back as 4,000 years. Mining evidence shows that ancient peoples extracted gypsum and other minerals from its depths. But beyond practical mining, there are deliberate drawings in spaces that serve no economic purpose. Some are located at choke points, where the ceiling drops low enough to force a crouch. To reach them is to submit physically to the cave. Archaeologist Patty Jo Watson's early work in the cave system documented prehistoric footprints preserved in clay, some belonging to adolescents. The idea of young individuals navigating pitch-black tunnels unsettles modern sensibilities, yet it suggests ritual apprenticeship, initiation into knowledge that required proximity to darkness. Certain charcoal figures depict what appear to be avian-human hybrids, elongated torsos, beaked heads. Scholars cautiously link them to Mississippian cosmological symbols found on pottery and shell ornaments elsewhere in the southeast. The upper world was associated with birds and celestial power. The beneath world was linked to serpents and water. The middle world, human existence, balanced between them. Inside Mammoth Cave, those cosmological layers are not abstract. They are embodied by stone. Descending physically into earth enacts the descent mythologically described. But some drawings seem incomplete, as if interrupted mid-gesture. In a few places, charcoal strokes trail off abruptly. Was the torch extinguished? Did ritual conclude suddenly? Or does erosion simply mimic interruption? Archaeology favours the mundane explanation. Pigment fades, clay shifts, flooding alters surfaces. Over millennia, walls reshape themselves. But when a line ends without closure, the imagination notices. Further north, in Ontario, the pictographs of Agawa Rock. Pictographs cling to a granite cliff face above water. Though not inside a cave, they occupy a liminal edge between land and lake. Painted by Anishinaabe artists centuries ago, the figures include canoes, thunderbirds, serpents, and humanoid forms in red ochre. Ethnographic records associate some of these images with vision quests and spiritual encounters. Water laps continuously at the rock base. Ice forms in winter. The paintings endure in defiance of erosion, yet their context has thinned. Colonial disruption fragmented the ceremonial frameworks in which such sites functioned. Missionary accounts from the 17th and 18th centuries often condemned pictograph sites as heathen relics. While many survived physically, the continuity of interpretive authority shifted. Sacred landscapes became tourist attractions. It is not deliberate erasure in the conspiratorial sense, it is transformation through contact. Knowledge moves from oral to academic, from lived ritual to museum documentation. Something is preserved, something is lost. In the southwest again, at Sego Canyon, multiple rock art styles overlap. Archaic Barrier Canyon, figures beside later Fremont anthropomorphs and Ute petroglyphs. The panel is a palimpsest spanning millennia. Large, hollow-eyed forms stand beside smaller, more defined human shapes. Horses appear in the upper layers, evidence of post-contact Ute artists adapting to a changed world. The juxtaposition is striking. One wall holds thousands of years of evolving cosmology. The earlier figures are faceless, spectral. The later ones are armed, mounted, dynamic. It is a visual record of cultural transition, no written archive required. Yet the earlier beings remain the most arresting. Their scale dwarfs later additions. Their eyes absorb light rather than reflect it. Some researchers have proposed that the Barrier Canyon figures represent spirit helpers encountered during shamanic trance. Others have explored the possibility that they encode mythic ancestors, primordial beings preceding ordinary humans. These hypotheses draw from cross-cultural ethnographic parallels cautiously applied. What remains undeniable is the emphasis on liminality, on beings between categories, on places between light and dark. Geological studies of canyon erosion indicate that many of these panels once stood in different microclimates than today. Shifts in river course and sediment deposition altered accessibility. A site once central could become remote. When environment reshapes access, ritual patterns shift. Memory migrates with population. There are also episodes of abrupt abandonment in North American prehistory. The depopulation of certain southwestern regions around the 13th century, for example, remains debated. Drought, social conflict, resource stress, all plausible factors. Archaeology documents migration, not annihilation. Yet from the perspective of a place left behind, abandonment can resemble disappearance. If a community ceases to visit a sacred site, its imagery becomes orphaned. Modern conservation efforts attempt to protect these paintings from vandalism and environmental damage. Access is restricted. Locations are sometimes withheld from public maps. Protection, again, resembles concealment. And so the pattern continues. Caves and cliffs holding images that were once animated by song and gesture now sit in curated stillness. What disturbs is not merely their aesthetic strangeness. It is the realization that entire interpretive systems can dissolve within a few centuries. The paintings endure, but the grammar that once unlocked them thins. In academic literature, the loss is acknowledged but framed cautiously. There is no assertion of hidden forces rewriting history. Instead, there is recognition that colonization, environmental change, and cultural transformation alter knowledge transmission. These are documented processes, yet documentation does not restore voice. Perhaps the most unsettling thought is that many of these figures were never intended for broad audience. They were meant for initiates, for those who understood their cosmological coordinates. Without that initiation, viewers stand outside the threshold. The cave does not explain itself, and if across this continent, in stone chambers and cliff faces, images persist that once mapped entire universes of meaning, then what does it say about the fragility of human continuity? What other grammars have faded so thoroughly that only pigment ghosts remain? The walls wait without commentary. They have endured drought, migration, conquest, and tourism. They endure still. But endurance is not revelation. And in the quiet spaces between charcoal lines and red ochre spirals, one question breathes faintly. Were these paintings marking a passage into sacred knowledge, or recording a moment when that knowledge was already slipping beyond reach? If some images feel like remnants of knowledge slipping away, others seem to suggest that something catastrophic once pressed itself into collective memory. Not a single event carved neatly into stone, but a tremor in worldview, an echo of rupture that surfaces in symbols across distant regions. In the high desert of Nevada at Grimes Point, petroglyphs cover basalt boulders scattered along an ancient shoreline. Archaeologists have dated some carvings to nearly 10,000 years ago, placing them near the end of the last ice age. When these figures were first pecked into stone, the landscape looked radically different. Lake Lahontan still filled much of the basin. Water shimmered where desert now stretches. The imagery is geometric, concentric circles, zigzags, lattices. Some figures resemble abstracted human forms, others suggest animals or tracks. The site has long been associated with Paleo-Indian habitation. Nearby excavations uncovered artifacts linked to early Holocene populations. There is nothing overtly monstrous here, no towering hollow-eyed beings, yet something unsettles in a different way. The knowledge that the environment itself transformed dramatically within a few millennia. Shorelines receded, climate stabilized into patterns closer to what is known today. If early artists recorded memory of shifting waters, if symbols encoded ecological awareness, then these stones preserve a witness to transition. Across North America, geological evidence confirms rapid environmental changes during the Younger Dryas period, roughly 12,900 to 11,700 years ago. Ice cores, sediment layers, and pollen records indicate abrupt cooling followed by warming. Debate continues about potential triggers: volcanic activity, ocean circulation shifts, even controversial impact hypotheses. Mainstream science remains cautious about extraterrestrial explanations, though research into microspherules and platinum anomalies has fueled discussion. Within indigenous oral traditions there are stories of floods, of fires from the sky, of worlds remade. These narratives vary widely across cultures, and scholars warn against homogenizing them into a single event. Oral tradition is not literal chronology, it encodes meaning symbolically. Still, the recurrence of catastrophe imagery is difficult to dismiss entirely. In the American Southwest, certain Barrier Canyon panels include what appear to be rain-like vertical streaks surrounding anthropomorphic figures. Some researchers have interpreted these as ceremonial rain motifs. Others note that the imagery coincides with periods of climatic instability identified through dendrochronology. The temptation arises to see ancient rock art as records of disaster, yet archaeology resists this narrative unless supported by material evidence. There are no widespread destruction layers clearly tied to cosmic impacts at the close of the Ice Age in North America. Settlements shift gradually, not in uniform collapse, but catastrophe need not annihilate to unsettle. In the canyons of Texas, some Pecos River murals depict serpents intertwined with human forms, their bodies fragmented, pierced by projectiles. Carolyn Boyd's interpretation of the White Shaman mural suggests a mythic narrative of creation and cosmic order. Yet within that narrative are scenes of transformation that appear violent, dismemberment, preceding reassembly. Across cultures, myths of world renewal often involve destruction. The old must fracture for the new to emerge. The imagery then may not be documenting a single geological event, but expressing cyclical cosmology. Still, the visual intensity remains. In Arizona, at Painted Rock Petroglyph site, spiral motifs dominate the basalt outcrop. Some researchers propose that certain spirals align with solar events, solstices marked by light passing through natural rock features. Archaeoastronomy has documented several such alignments in the southwest, though interpretations vary. If spirals mark solar cycles, then they track stability, the predictable return of seasons. Yet spirals also resemble whirlpools, storms, vortices. The same symbol can encode reassurance and chaos. Perhaps disturbance lies not in the motif itself, but in its ambiguity. Anthropologists have long debated whether North American prehistoric societies experienced what might be termed cultural resets. Evidence suggests migration and adaptation rather than extinction. Populations moved when drought intensified. Social structures reorganized when trade networks faltered. The archaeological record shows continuity, albeit transformed. There is no scholarly consensus supporting the idea of a lost advanced civilization erased in a single cataclysm. That narrative belongs more to fringe speculation than to documented evidence. And yet, even within cautious academic frameworks, acknowledgement persists that environmental stress has repeatedly forced profound social shifts. When drought grips a region for decades, ceremonial systems strain. When resources thin, alliances shift. Ritual intensifies in response to uncertainty. The caves and petroglyph sites, then, may reflect these periods of stress, not as historical reportage, but as symbolic negotiation with instability. Still, the emotional impact of certain images transcends climate theory. In Utah's Sego Canyon, the earlier archaic figures appear ghostly beside later Fremont images. It is as if one world view overlays another without merging. The transition is visible in stone. A shift in symbolic grammar has occurred. What if the most disturbing possibility is not hidden catastrophe, but repeated transformation? Not annihilation, but reconfiguration so complete that prior cosmologies become unrecognizable to descendants. Language studies show that linguistic families in North America diversified over thousands of years, with branches splitting and migrating. Oral traditions evolve. Myths adapt to new landscapes, yet rock art endures physically long after its linguistic key fades. In some cases, later indigenous groups acknowledged that certain older pictographs were not their own. Ethnographic interviews in the 19th and 20th centuries occasionally record elders describing ancient images as belonging to people before us, not as aliens or mythic giants, but as previous inhabitants whose names no longer survived. This acknowledgement of layered occupation complicates linear narratives. North America was never culturally static. Peoples moved, replaced, assimilated, adapted. When a group inherits a landscape marked by earlier symbols, interpretation becomes speculative, even within traditional frameworks. Perhaps what disturbs is the realization that even ancient communities encountered mystery in their own past. They too stood before images left by predecessors, wondering at their meaning. And if that chain of curiosity stretches back millennia, generation after generation confronting the residue of earlier thought, then the caves become recursive mirrors. Not warnings from beyond, but reminders of continuity interrupted. The basalt boulders at Grimes Point still face the dry basin where water once shimmered. The charcoal figures in Mammoth Cave still cling to damp walls. The spirals at Painted Rock still trace curves beneath open sky. None declare catastrophe outright. None confirm civilizational annihilation. Yet each testifies to change profound enough to reshape belief. Perhaps the disturbance lies in this, that human societies can adapt so completely to new realities that the emotional memory of prior worlds condenses into symbol, stripped of explanatory narrative. And when that symbol survives longer than the story that birthed it, viewers stand before a fragment of transformation without knowing what was transformed. Stone remembers stone. But it does not translate, and somewhere between climate shifts and cosmological myths, between spiral and serpent, a quiet question lingers. Were these images meant to warn of forces beyond control, or to steady those who sense their world already slipping into something unfamiliar? If transformation can be gradual, almost gentle in the way it reshapes memory, then there are other sites where the imagery feels less like adaptation and more like confrontation. Some cave walls do not whisper of seasonal change or cyclical myth. They appear to freeze a moment of encounter, an intensity that seems to strain against the limits of pigment and stone. In the arid canyons of northern Arizona near the Colorado River corridor, rock art panels associated with what archaeologists call the San Juan anthropomorphic style present towering broad-shouldered figures. These beings often have rectangular torsos, horned or feathered headpieces, and large staring eyes. Some hold objects interpreted as staffs or ceremonial implements. Others are flanked by smaller, more diminutive human forms. While less elongated than the Barrier Canyon figures of Utah, these anthropomorphs still resist comfortable familiarity. They dominate the panels, sometimes arranged in rows as if assembled. Archaeologists have tentatively dated many of these images between 1,000 and 2,000 years old, though exact chronologies remain debated due to the challenges of dating petroglyphs directly. There is no written record describing these figures. Interpretations draw from comparative analysis of later Puebloan iconography and ethnographic accounts recorded after Spanish contact. Horned or masked beings appear in Pueblo cosmology as Katsinam, spiritual entities representing natural forces, ancestors, or moral principles. Yet projecting later beliefs backward carries risk. Cultural continuity may exist, but it is rarely linear. Some panels include depictions that appear violent, figures pierced by arrows or surrounded by dismembered shapes. Archaeologists typically interpret these scenes within ritual frameworks: symbolic death and rebirth, mythic battles between spiritual forces. Violence in myth is rarely literal documentation. It encodes transformation. And yet the emotional weight of such imagery persists even when framed academically. In Nevada's Great Basin, petroglyphs at sites such as Lago Marcino Canyon cover canyon walls with dense clusters of abstract forms, concentric circles, labyrinthine lines, stick figures with exaggerated limbs fill the basalt surfaces. The density alone is striking. Hundreds of carvings layered over centuries. Researchers have proposed multiple interpretations: hunting records, territorial markers, vision quest imagery. Some motifs resemble entoptic patterns observed in neurological studies of altered states. Others appear narrative, lines connecting figures as though mapping relationships or journeys. What stands out is repetition. Certain shapes recur across vast distances in the Great Basin. Spirals, grids, anthropomorphs with raised arms appear again and again. This recurrence suggests shared symbolic language, though its grammar remains partially opaque. Environmental records indicate that the Great Basin experienced significant fluctuations in water availability during the Holocene. Lakes expanded and contracted. Resources shifted. Archaeological evidence points to long-term occupation punctuated by mobility. It is within this context that some scholars cautiously explore the idea of cultural stress responses. When subsistence patterns destabilize, ritual often intensifies. Art becomes a medium for negotiating uncertainty. Still, the question lingers: why do so many of these anthropomorphs possess exaggerated eyes? Evolutionary psychology offers one explanation. The human brain is highly attuned to gaze detection. Enlarged eyes amplify the sensation of being watched. In low-light environments, caves, dusk-lit canyons, such features can heighten emotional response. But ancient artists may have understood this intuitively. To create presence, one emphasizes eyes. In British Columbia, along the Pacific Northwest coast, pictographs attributed to various First Nations communities depict thunderbirds, whales, and supernatural beings in red ochre along cliff faces. Though not always inside caves, many occupy sheltered rock overhangs accessible only by water. Oral traditions collected in the 19th century speak of transformative encounters between humans and powerful non-human beings inhabiting specific places. The imagery is not decorative. It marks sites of story and warning. Colonial accounts from early explorers occasionally mention these painted cliffs with curiosity or dismissal. Few understood the cosmological depth embedded there. Over time, industrial activity and natural erosion have damaged some panels. Others remain protected through collaboration with indigenous communities. There is no evidence that knowledge was systematically erased by a singular controlling force. Yet cultural suppression policies in the 19th and early 20th centuries, residential schools, bans on ceremonies, undeniably disrupted oral transmission. The loss was administrative rather than conspiratorial, but its impact was profound. When ritual languages are silenced, symbols risk becoming aesthetic artifacts rather than living conduits. In parts of the American Southwest, archaeologists have documented instances where later groups intentionally repainted or modified earlier images. This suggests reinterpretation rather than abandonment. A site remains sacred even if its meaning evolves. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that disturbance may be cumulative. Images created in times of stress, reinterpreted in times of transition, viewed centuries later through academic frameworks. They accumulate layers of partial understanding. The caves do not reveal whether their creators believed in imminent catastrophe, cosmic beings, or purely symbolic transformation. They reveal only that certain encounters, inner or outer, were significant enough to fix in stone. Some fringe theories propose that prehistoric rock art depicts extraterrestrial visitors or lost advanced civilizations. These interpretations circulate widely in popular media, yet mainstream archaeology finds no material evidence supporting such claims. The tools, settlements, and subsistence patterns recovered from excavations align with known technological stages of hunter-gatherer and early agricultural societies. The disturbance, then, does not require aliens or vanished empires. It arises from the intensity of human engagement with mystery itself. Perhaps ancient communities confronted experiences, visions, ecological upheaval, social rupture that demanded symbolic articulation. The cave provided a chamber where those experiences could be externalized, and over centuries, as languages branched and ceremonies transformed, the symbols remained anchored to rock while their explanatory scaffolding thinned. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere beneath layers of mineral deposit, beneath soot and sediment, lies a panel that would clarify everything, a Rosetta Stone of North American prehistory. But archaeology rarely grants such symmetry. Instead, it offers fragments, eyes without voices, spirals without narration, serpents without full mythic context. What disturbs is not that something supernatural stands behind the paint. It is that human meaning can be so deeply invested in symbol and yet so vulnerable to erosion. If entire cosmologies once unfolded beneath these ceilings, structured, coherent, alive, then their current opacity testifies to the fragility of continuity. And perhaps that fragility is the quiet warning embedded in every hollow-eyed figure. Not that catastrophe will descend from beyond, but that knowledge, if not tended, can recede into abstraction within a handful of generations. The canyon walls do not insist on interpretation. They hold their silence with patience. And as light shifts across petroglyphs carved millennia ago, the question remains suspended in mineral stillness. Were these beings guardians of sacred knowledge, or witnesses to the slow, almost imperceptible drift of worlds into unfamiliar forms? If the eyes are what linger most in memory, then there are places where they seem to multiply, where the rock face becomes a field of watchers, each gaze fixed in an expression that refuses easy interpretation. The sensation is not always fear. Sometimes it is something quieter, heavier, as though the stone itself has absorbed generations of attention and now returns it without blinking. In the high plateau of central Utah, at 9 Mile Canyon, thousands of petroglyphs and pictographs stretch along sandstone walls. The canyon is often called the world's longest art gallery, though that phrase feels too casual for what stands there. Panels display bighorn sheep, hunters, geometric forms, and anthropomorphic beings with large circular eyes and horned headdresses. Some of these figures belong to the Fremont culture, which flourished roughly between 300 and 1300 CE. Others may be older, layered beneath newer carvings. Among the Fremont images, there are scenes that suggest daily life, granaries, domesticated turkeys, hunting scenes. Yet beside these familiar elements appear figures that defy simple categorization. Broad torsos taper into stick-like legs. Faces are dominated by oversized eyes, sometimes deeply pecked into stone so that shadows gather within them. Some figures seem bound or segmented, as though constructed from separate parts. Archaeologists interpret Fremont rock art within the broader context of agricultural transition and regional trade networks. The Fremont people cultivated maize, interacted with neighbouring ancestral Puebloan communities, and adapted to fluctuating environmental conditions. Around the 13th century, many Fremont settlements were abandoned. Explanations range from drought cycles to social reorganisation. The archaeological record shows migration rather than sudden disappearance. Yet in the canyon, the figures remain, detached from the settlements that once gave them context. There is a peculiar stillness in these images. Unlike narrative murals in the lower Picos, the Fremont panels often isolate figures without obvious storyline. They stand, frontal and unmoving, as if caught in perpetual witness. Their eyes, carved deeply, create the illusion of depth even when the surface erodes. Some researchers have suggested that such figures represent masked ritual participants. Ethnographic parallels from later Puebloan traditions describe masked dancers embodying spiritual beings during ceremonies. If so, the rock art may record sacred performances rather than literal entities. But performance implies audience. Who was meant to see these carvings? The canyon walls are exposed to open sky, not hidden in darkness. Travellers along the corridor would have encountered them repeatedly. Perhaps the images functioned as territorial markers, declarations of presence in a landscape shared and contested. Still, the intensity of gaze suggests more than territorial claim. It suggests encounter. In Wyoming's Wind River Range, high above treeline, petroglyphs etched into granite at sites like Legend Rock Petroglyph Site depict human and animal forms layered across thousands of years. Bison dominate many panels, reflecting the deep relationship between plains cultures and migratory herds. Yet interspersed among these are abstracted anthropomorphs with exaggerated features, some headless, others with radiating lines extending from their bodies. Archaeological surveys indicate that Legend Rock contains imagery spanning at least 10,000 years. This temporal depth complicates interpretation. A single panel may represent multiple cultural phases, each adding or modifying earlier carvings. What appears as a unified composition may in fact be a conversation across millennia. Conversations, however, can become fragmented. When a later group encounters older imagery, they may reinterpret or incorporate it without fully knowing its origin. Ethnographic interviews with Plains elders in the 20th century occasionally acknowledged uncertainty about the meaning of certain ancient carvings. They were recognized as powerful, but not fully understood. This admission of partial knowledge is striking. It suggests that even within indigenous continuity, layers of symbolism could become opaque over long durations. Perhaps opacity is inevitable in deep time. In the canyonlands of Colorado, at Canyon Pintado Historic District, panels attributed to the Fremont and earlier archaic traditions include anthropomorphs with hollowed eyes and broad shoulders, sometimes adorned with what appear to be necklaces or belts. Some figures are pierced by vertical lines interpreted as arrows or spears. Others appear flanked by animals in symmetrical arrangement. The juxtaposition of adornment and wounding unsettles the viewer. Is this depiction of ritual sacrifice, mythic trial, social hierarchy? Archaeologists caution that weapon imagery does not always signify violence in the modern sense. It can symbolize power, authority, or mythic narrative. Yet the imagery resists comfort. It does not present pastoral calm, it presents intensity. Environmental reconstructions show that the Colorado Plateau experienced significant drought during the late 13th century. Tree ring data revealed decades of reduced precipitation. Archaeological evidence indicates population shifts during this period, with some settlements abandoned. Ritual systems likely adapted in response to scarcity. It is within such contexts that symbolic art often flourishes, not as escapism, but as negotiation with instability. Still, The repeated motif of large, staring eyes across multiple regions raises questions. Eyes are not merely anatomical features in these carvings. They are emphasized beyond proportion. They dominate expression. Neurological studies demonstrate that humans instinctively seek eye contact as a signal of social presence. Enlarged eyes in art can trigger heightened awareness, even mild unease. Ancient artists, consciously or not, may have harnessed this cognitive bias to evoke a sense of being observed. Observed by whom? Perhaps by the spirits invoked in ceremony, perhaps by ancestors remembered in stone, or perhaps by the community itself, reminded through carved gaze of moral or cosmological order. There is no evidence that these panels conceal knowledge suppressed by external authorities in prehistoric times. The disruptions that later fractured interpretation, colonial expansion, forced relocation, cultural suppression, are historically documented processes, not secret manipulations. Yet their cumulative effect resembles erasure to those who inherit partial archives. The stone retains form. The voice thins. It is tempting to imagine that somewhere in oral traditions unrecorded, explanations once flowed effortlessly, stories that aligned every spiral, every gaze, every pierced torso into coherent cosmology. That coherence may have endured for centuries before shifting again. What disturbs now is the silence where those narratives once resonated. Standing before a panel in 9 Mile Canyon or Canyon Pintado, one senses that the figures were never meant to be decorative curiosities. They carried weight, ritual, social, cosmological weight. They were anchors in uncertain times, and yet without the cadence of original language, viewers remain at threshold. The canyon wind moves across sandstone as it has for millennia. The eyes carved into rock neither blink nor close. They have watched drought, migration, conquest, preservation. They have watched interpretation evolve, and as light changes across their surfaces, the question lingers in quiet suspension. Are these figures guardians of knowledge that once steadied communities through change, or reminders that even the most carefully carved meanings can drift into abstraction when memory loosens its grip? If the carved eyes seem to watch from open canyon walls, there are other places where the gaze feels enclosed, intensified by stone pressing inward from every side. Deep caves create a different kind of encounter. The air cools, sound folds in on itself, time loses sharp edges. And within that pressure, certain images feel less like declarations and more like thresholds that were meant to be crossed only with preparation. In the limestone systems of eastern Tennessee, researchers mapping subterranean passages in the late 20th century documented an extensive body of mud glyphs within Mud Glyph Cave. Unlike painted pictographs, these images were drawn by fingers directly into soft cave clay. Human figures, serpents, cross-like forms and winged shapes appear along narrow corridors that require crawling. Many are located hundreds of feet from natural light. Radiocarbon dating of associated torch fragments places the activity primarily in the Mississippian period, roughly 1000 to 1500 CE. This was an era of complex societies across the southeast, marked by mound-building, regional trade and elaborate ceremonial systems. Yet the cave glyphs are intimate, almost urgent. Some human forms appear elongated, ribs suggested by shallow grooves. Others have outstretched arms and oversized hands, as if reaching beyond the confines of the wall. Archaeologists such as Jan Simek have interpreted these glyphs within the framework of southeastern indigenous cosmology, in which caves represent portals to the beneath world, a realm associated with water, serpents, and powerful spiritual forces. Ethnographic records collected centuries later among descendant communities describe a layered universe, an upper world of celestial beings, a middle world of humans, and an underworld accessible through caves and springs. Within this cosmological structure, entering a cave was not casual exploration. It was deliberate descent. The imagery supports this interpretation. Serpents, often linked to water and underworld power, wind through the clay. Winged figures suggest upper world associations. Humans appear positioned between them. The cave becomes a vertical map of existence. Yet some glyphs resist simple cosmological categorization. A few figures appear headless. Others seem segmented, their bodies divided by lines as though disassembled. One panel depicts what researchers cautiously interpret as a hand emerging from stone itself. The suggestion of emergence, of something crossing from one realm into another, intensifies the atmosphere. Scientific caution remains essential. The glyphs likely encode mythic narratives, ritual journeys, or initiation rites. There is no material evidence suggesting that these communities believed in extraterrestrial beings or hidden advanced civilizations. The artifacts recovered from Mississippian sites align with known technological and social patterns of agricultural societies. And yet, when one stands in a chamber carved by geological time, tracing finger-grooved forms made centuries ago in absolute darkness, the emotional impact is undeniable. The cave alters physiology. Speleological studies have shown that extended exposure to darkness affects circadian rhythms, perception of time, and even auditory sensitivity. The act of crawling into narrow passages induces vulnerability. Ritual specialists may have intentionally harnessed these sensory shifts to facilitate transformative experiences. Transformative experiences leave residue. Across the continent in Missouri, the panels of Picture Cave preserve painted figures associated with the southeastern ceremonial complex. Among them are horned serpents and avian warriors. Some figures appear skeletal or partially flayed. Scholars interpret these as mythic beings tied to cosmological cycles of death and rebirth. Death imagery in ritual context does not necessarily signal morbidity. It can symbolize transition. In many traditions, initiation requires symbolic death before rebirth into new status. But what if some of these images were also responses to instability? The late Mississippian period saw social upheaval in several regions. Archaeological evidence points to site abandonment, shifting trade networks, and in some cases increased fortification around settlements. Climatic stress, resource competition, and internal conflict may all have played roles. Ritual intensifies under uncertainty. Caves, already liminal, become stages for negotiating unseen forces. Still, there is something about the tactile immediacy of mud glyphs that feels different from pecked petroglyphs or painted murals. Finger marks remain visible. The grooves preserve the motion of hands pressing into clay centuries ago. It is an imprint of touch. Touch suggests urgency. In Alabama, within the limestone passages of Glyph Cave, charcoal figures also appear deep underground. Some are accompanied by cane torch stubs left where ancient visitors wedge them into cracks for light. Radiocarbon analysis confirms prehistoric visitation extending thousands of years into the past. The charcoal lines are faint, easily smudged by careless contact. Modern conservation efforts restrict access to prevent damage. Knowledge of the site's location is not widely publicized. Protection, once again, resembles concealment, but it is concealment for preservation rather than secrecy. Still, the idea persists. Entire symbolic systems enacted in darkness, their meanings partially inaccessible even to descendant communities due to centuries of disruption. Colonial policies in the 18th and 19th centuries suppressed indigenous ceremonies across much of North America. Ritual specialists were targeted. Oral transmission fractured under forced relocation and boarding school systems. While many traditions survived and continue today, others were altered or lost. The cave glyphs predate these disruptions, yet their interpretive continuity has been affected by them. A chain broken centuries later still influences understanding. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that these underground images were never meant for mass audience. They were for initiates, for those willing to descend to risk disorientation. Without initiation, modern observers encounter only surface form. The human mind, faced with incomplete information, seeks narrative closure. It fills gaps with speculation. Some popular theories project aliens or lost supercivilizations into these chambers, yet archaeological evidence does not support such claims. The tools and remains recovered from associated sites allow us with known cultural trajectories. The disturbance, then, is not in supernatural intrusion. It lies in the recognition that human communities can construct profoundly complex symbolic universes that function coherently for centuries, and yet become partially opaque within a relatively short span of historical time. Stone persists, clay hardens, pigment clings, voice fades, and as researchers document, photograph, and analyse these glyphs under controlled lighting, one wonders what it meant to see them only by flickering torchlight. Smoke-thickened lungs, heart pounding in confined air. What conversations unfolded in those chambers? What fears were confronted? What assurances were offered? The mud preserves the movement of fingers long stilled, and somewhere between clay grooves and charcoal lines, a question settles like dust in still air. Were these caves entered to seek answers from the beneath world, or to confront the quiet realization that even sacred knowledge must eventually pass through darkness before emerging again into uncertain light? If descent into darkness was once a ritual act, then there are places where the descent seems to have extended not only into stone, but into the imagination itself. Some rock art panels feel less like gateways to cosmology and more like mirrors reflecting something fractured within human experience. Not catastrophe, not invasion, something subtler, more interior. In the high desert of California, near the Coso Range, the petroglyphs of Coso Rock Art District stretch across volcanic rock faces in astonishing density. Thousands of carvings depict bighorn sheep, hunters with atlatls, geometric patterns, and anthropomorphic figures with raised arms or exaggerated limbs. The site is one of the most extensive rock art concentrations in North America, with some carvings dated to over 10,000 years old. The dominant presence of bighorn sheep has led many archaeologists to interpret the site within a hunting magic framework. Ethnographic parallels from Great Basin cultures describe rituals aimed at ensuring successful hunts, but among the sheep and hunters appear figures that defy purely subsistence-based explanation. Some anthropomorphs appear headless. Others have multiple limbs or radiating lines extending from their bodies. A few seem caught mid-transformation, neither fully human nor fully animal. Researchers have proposed that these images may relate to shamanistic trance experiences. Neuropsychological models suggest that during altered states, individuals may perceive sensations of bodily distortion, elongation, fragmentation, merging with animal forms. If shamans carve these experiences into stone, the petroglyphs become records of interior journeys rather than external events. Yet trance is not necessarily tranquil. Ethnographic accounts from various cultures describe shamanic initiations as terrifying ordeals, symbolic dismemberment, encounters with predatory spirits, descent into underworld realms. If some of the Coso anthropomorphs depict fragmented bodies, they may encode such narratives of symbolic death and rebirth. The desert landscape intensifies the impression. Volcanic rock absorbs heat by day and radiates it by night. The silence stretches wide. In such environments, perception sharpens. Shadows distort scale. The mind becomes acutely aware of its own processes. It is possible that the disturbance modern viewers feel is an echo of the intensity once sought deliberately in these spaces. Far to the east in Arkansas, pictographs in limestone shelters at sites like Petit Jean State Park include red ochre depictions of anthropomorphs, animals, and abstract motifs. Some figures appear skeletal, ribs etched in thin lines. Others seem cloaked, their bodies outlined but faces obscured. Dating these images precisely remains difficult. Estimates place many in the late prehistoric period, possibly Mississippian. Interpretations often draw from southeastern cosmology, linking skeletal imagery to mythic themes of transformation. Still, skeletal representation carries emotional weight. Bones signify mortality. Even when symbolic, they confront viewers with fragility. Archaeology does not interpret these as literal records of violence or epidemic. There is no widespread skeletal trauma in associated burial sites indicating mass catastrophe at the time of painting. The imagery likely reflects mythic structure rather than historical event, but myth arises from lived experience. Communities facing drought, conflict, or social upheaval may articulate uncertainty through symbolic death and renewal. Environmental data from sediment cores across North America reveal repeated episodes of climatic fluctuation throughout the Holocene. None amount to global annihilation. Yet for localized communities, prolonged drought or resource scarcity could feel existential. In times of instability, ritual often intensifies. Symbols grow more dramatic. Art becomes a vessel for negotiating unseen forces. And yet, beyond ecological stress, there is another layer to consider: the interior landscape of human cognition. Modern neuroscience recognizes that humans are pattern-seeking creatures. In darkness or ambiguity, the brain amplifies shapes into presences. The same neurological mechanisms that enable symbolic thought can also generate experiences interpreted as spiritual encounter. If ancient artists externalize such experiences onto stone, then rock art may represent the boundary between neurology and cosmology. This does not diminish its significance. On the contrary, it deepens it. Across multiple regions, Coso, Great Basin, Southeast, there recurs the motif of human forms undergoing alteration, elongation, fragmentation, hybridization. Hybrid beings appear in mythologies worldwide, often symbolizing liminal states. They bridge worlds, animal and human, life and death, earth and sky. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that these images do not depict a stable universe. They depict permeability. Boundaries blur, bodies open, and when boundaries blur, certainty dissolves. Colonial disruption centuries later compounded this dissolution. Ceremonies were suppressed, oral traditions fractured. Even when practices survived, they adapted to altered realities. Rock art, fixed in stone, became detached from its living interpretive matrix. There is no evidence of secret archives deliberately withholding explanations. The loss is structural, historical, and yet the effect is similar to secrecy. Viewers stand before symbols that once pulsed with clarity, now partially veiled. In some indigenous communities today, elders acknowledge that certain ancient pictographs represent knowledge not fully retained. Respect for the sites remains, even when complete explanation does not. Perhaps this humility offers a model for modern interpretation, not to impose narratives of aliens or hidden empires, but to accept that symbolic systems can exceed our present capacity to decode them. The desert panels of the Coso Range do not explain themselves. They do not confirm apocalypse or extraterrestrial contact. They record human engagement with mystery, intense, embodied, transformative, and perhaps that is disturbance enough. To confront the possibility that ancient communities experienced reality in ways that destabilize modern assumptions of rational order. To recognize that symbolic death, dismemberment, and hybridization may reflect psychological journeys as profound as any external catastrophe. The rock does not tell whether these journeys were comforting or terrifying. It preserves only form. And as the sun sets over volcanic ridges and shadows stretch across carved sheep and skeletal forms, a quiet question lingers in the cooling air. Were these images warnings of forces beyond control, or maps of inner territories that every generation must navigate anew, even as the original language of the map fades into silence. If the gaze of painted figures unsettles because it suggests presence, then there are other sites where the disturbance lies not in eyes, but in absence. Figures without faces, bodies without heads, silhouettes that seem deliberately emptied. In these images, something has been removed or withheld, and the void itself becomes expressive. In the canyons of western Colorado, within what is known as Canyon Pintado Historic District, large anthropomorphic forms dominate vertical sandstone walls. Many are attributed to the Fremont culture, though earlier archaic elements persist beneath them. Some of these figures are broad and rectangular, their torsos adorned with necklaces or belts etched in detail. Yet their faces are often blank or reduced to simple slits. In several panels, heads appear disproportionately small compared to massive shoulders, as though identity has been compressed. Archaeologists interpret the adornment as markers of status or ceremonial role. Fremont communities practiced a mixed subsistence strategy of farming and foraging, interacting with neighbouring ancestral Puebloan groups. Their material culture suggests complexity, trade, and ritual life. But what does it mean to carve a body with elaborate detail while leaving the face vacant? In human perception, the face anchors individuality. To erase or minimize it can imply universality or anonymity. Perhaps these figures were not portraits but embodiments of forces beyond individual identity. Elsewhere, in Nevada's Black Rock Desert, petroglyphs at sites such as Pyramid Lake petroglyphs include anthropomorphs with raised arms and hollowed torsos. Some appear headless entirely, their necks ending abruptly. Archaeological surveys date portions of this rock art to several thousand years ago, though precise chronology remains difficult. Headless figures appear across global rock art traditions. Some scholars interpret them as representations of decapitation rituals. Others see them as metaphors for spiritual transformation, loss of ordinary consciousness before visionary experience. There is little material evidence in Great Basin burial sites to suggest widespread ritual decapitation. Skeletal remains generally do not display systematic head removal. This suggests symbolic rather than literal representation. Still, symbolism can be potent. In the lower Pecos Canyon lands of Texas, certain mural fragments include figures that appear dismembered, limbs detached yet arranged in symmetrical pattern. Carolyn Boyd's analysis of the White Shaman mural proposes that such imagery encodes mythic cosmology rather than historical violence. Creation myths often involve primordial beings whose bodies are divided to form the world. Division precedes order. But for modern viewers, fragmentation evokes vulnerability. It confronts the fragility of form. Environmental data show that prehistoric communities across North America navigated repeated climatic fluctuations. While no single apocalypse erased civilization, local disruptions were frequent. Settlement, abandonment, migration, reorganization. These processes left material traces but rarely dramatic destruction layers. The rock art does not confirm a lost supercivilization or suppressed epoch. Archaeology consistently supports continuity of hunter-gatherer and early agricultural lifeways evolving over millennia. And yet, the symbolic intensity of certain panels suggests that communities were acutely aware of instability, whether ecological, social, or spiritual. In Utah's Sego Canyon, early Barrier Canyon figures with hollow eyes stand beside later Ute petroglyphs that depict horses introduced after European contact. The juxtaposition compresses centuries into a single stone surface. Earlier spectral beings face later mounted warriors. The transition is visible, cultures change, symbols adapt. But the earlier faceless figures remain the most arresting. Some anthropologists suggest that facelessness in rock art may represent masked participants in ritual performance. Masks conceal personal identity to embody communal or supernatural forces. Ethnographic records from Puebloan communities describe masked dancers representing Katsinam, spiritual intermediaries between humans and the cosmos? If so, the blank faces are not erasure but transformation. The individual dissolves into role. Still, when the original ceremonial context fades, the blankness feels like absence. In parts of northern Mexico and the US Southwest, rock shelters contain rows of small, identical anthropomorphic figures, stick-like, faceless, uniform. Repetition suggests collective identity rather than individuality. Perhaps these panels marked communal rites of passage, initiations where personal identity temporarily yielded to group cohesion. But repetition also creates anonymity. What happens when a culture shifts so profoundly that communal rites are altered or discontinued? The stone retains the anonymous figures, but the lived experience behind them becomes distant. Colonial policies in the 18th and 19th centuries accelerated such shifts. Forced relocations, missionary suppression of ceremonies, and assimilation programs disrupted ritual continuity. Even where tradition survived, adaptation was necessary. The result is layered opacity. Modern descendants may retain elements of ancestral cosmology, yet certain ancient images remain partially obscure even within living memory. There is no grand conspiracy hiding their meaning. There is historical rupture. The absence of faces then becomes doubly resonant. First as symbolic transformation, second as historical thinning. In California's Carrizo Plain, the pictographs at Painted Rock include concentric circles and abstract human forms. Some appear with elongated necks or minimal facial detail. The site is sacred to the Chumash people, who continue to hold ceremonies nearby. Ethnographic records describe vision quests and spiritual encounters associated with the rock. Continuity persists here more visibly than at some other sites. Yet even within continuity, certain ancient motifs resist full explanation. Knowledge transmitted orally can evolve subtly over generations. Perhaps the most unsettling realization is that identity itself, whether personal or cultural, is fluid. Faces can be masked, names can shift. Ritual roles can outlast the individuals who first enacted them. The rock art, fixed and unblinking, becomes a counterpoint to that fluidity. It holds forms stripped of context, inviting projection while resisting certainty. Modern viewers trained in linear historical thinking seek narrative resolution. Who were they? What happened? Why the fragmentation? Archaeology offers measured answers grounded in material evidence, evolving subsistence patterns, climatic variability, symbolic cosmology. It does not confirm hidden epochs erased from record. Yet the emotional resonance of faceless, fragmented figures persists beyond academic caution, perhaps because they reflect something universal, the knowledge that identity is provisional, that societies transform, that what feels solid today may become symbol tomorrow. The sandstone cliffs endure wind and sun, faces remain blank, bodies remain segmented, and in their silence, a question gathers like shadow at dusk. Were these figures reminders that individuality dissolves into something larger? Or warnings that when memory falters, even the most carefully carved identities can fade into anonymous form, leaving only the outline of what once was known? If some images confront openly from canyon walls, others seem almost reluctant, half hidden beneath the mineral veils revealed only when light strikes at the right angle. There are places in North America where paintings survived not because they were protected by reverence alone, but because geology itself conspired to shield them, and yet even preservation can distort. In the limestone bluffs of eastern Missouri, beyond the better-known panels of Picture Cave, smaller rock shelters contain faint red ochre figures attributed to late prehistoric communities. Many are barely visible now, obscured by calcite deposits formed as water slowly seeped over the walls. Archaeologists have used non-invasive imaging techniques, such as dia-stretch enhancement, to reveal shapes invisible to the naked eye. Under digital filtration, figures emerge, anthropomorphs with raised arms, serpents coiling in shallow arcs, abstract crosses and grids. Technology restores outline but not voice. Calcite growth suggests centuries of slow mineral accretion. The paintings were not sealed intentionally, they were enveloped gradually. Water carrying dissolved limestone crystallized over pigment, preserving and obscuring simultaneously. There is something unsettling about that duality, preservation through concealment. Further south, in Florida's limestone caves, rare prehistoric pictographs have been documented in submerged chambers accessible only through underwater exploration. At sites like Warm Mineral Springs, archaeologists have recovered ancient human remains and artifacts from sinkholes dating back over 10,000 years. While the springs themselves are not richly painted like southwestern caves, they testify to human engagement with deep water environments during the early Holocene. In Florida's karst landscapes, rising sea levels at the end of the Ice Age submerged caves that were once dry. Any imagery created within them may now lie beneath layers of water and sediment. Divers have documented submerged stalactites and human artifacts, but the full extent of potential rock art remains uncertain. If paintings once adorned those now flooded chambers, they are lost to ordinary access. Not erased deliberately, but drowned by geological time. Across the continent, rising sea levels reshaped coastlines after the last glacial maximum. Entire Paleo-Indian habitation sites now lie offshore. Archaeologists acknowledge that the archaeological record is incomplete, skewed toward areas that remained dry. What stories were painted on walls now submerged beneath Atlantic or Pacific waves? There is no evidence of advanced lost civilizations hidden beneath these waters. Excavations of submerged sites reveal stone tools consistent with known Paleo-Indian technologies. Yet even within established frameworks, acknowledgement persists. Vast portions of early human activity are inaccessible due to sea level rise. Loss, again, without conspiracy. In the high desert of Oregon, petroglyphs at Paisley Caves are overshadowed by the site's more famous archaeological discoveries. Coprolites dated to over 14,000 years ago, providing some of the earliest evidence of human presence in North America. While the caves are not adorned with the elaborate murals of Texas or Utah, nearby rock art in the region includes abstract designs and anthropomorphic forms attributed to later Great Basin cultures. Paisley Caves illustrate continuity across immense time spans. Humans occupied the region near the end of the Ice Age and continued for millennia. But continuity does not imply static meaning. Cultural expressions shifted repeatedly as climate stabilized and ecosystems transformed. When archaeologists excavate Paisley Caves, they peel back layers of sediment, each stratum representing centuries of occupation. The metaphor extends to rock art itself. Each panel may represent a layer of meaning added across generations. Yet when layers accumulate without complete record, interpretation becomes partial. There is also the matter of vandalism. Throughout the 19th and 20th centuries, numerous North American rock art sites were damaged by graffiti, bullet impacts, or removal of stone panels for private collections. This destruction is documented in conservation reports. In some cases, entire sections of painted wall were cut away and sold. The result is fragmentation. Museums preserve fragments under controlled lighting, detached from landscape. The canyon wind no longer touches them. The context shifts from ritual environment to exhibition hall. Preservation without place alters perception. At Hueco tanks and other protected sites, modern management balances public access with conservation. Guides explain scholarly interpretations cautiously, emphasizing collaboration with indigenous communities. Yet even careful interpretation cannot restore original experiential context. Torchlight, chanting, the scent of smoke. Perhaps the most disturbing realization is how many variables influence survival: geology, climate, human interference, chance. Some images endured because water sealed them, others vanished because stone flaked. Some were preserved through reverence, others were lost through curiosity or neglect. The record that remains is partial not because of deliberate censorship, but because of time's uneven hand. Still, when viewers stand before digitally enhanced panels, revealing faint anthropomorphs long hidden beneath calcite, the sensation is uncanny. It is as though the stone breathes out something long held. Digital enhancement can amplify pigment contrast, revealing shapes invisible to naked eye. Yet enhancement risks projection. Algorithms may intensify patterns that were originally subtle, inviting overinterpretation. Modern technology uncovers but also mediates. In academic literature, researchers caution against romantic narratives of hidden messages waiting to be decoded. Rock art is not a cipher concealing a singular secret. It is expression embedded in social and environmental context. And yet, when so much context is eroded or submerged, imagination fills the void. Perhaps the deeper disturbance lies not in what the images depict, but in the recognition that the archaeological record is inherently incomplete. Sea levels rose, minerals formed, walls collapsed, human hands damaged and restored. What survives is what chance allowed. And if entire painted chambers now lie beneath ocean floors or sealed behind mineral crusts, then our understanding of early symbolic life on this continent is necessarily fragmentary. Fragmentary knowledge can feel like concealment, even when it is merely erosion. The calcite-veiled figures in Missouri's shelters still cling to stone. The submerged caves of Florida hold secrets beneath clear water. The windswept basins of Oregon carry memory in sediment layers. None announce hidden empires or suppressed truths. They whisper of continuity interrupted by nature and history alike, and as imaging software reveals faint anthropomorphs beneath mineral sheen, the question emerges softly, almost reluctantly. Were these paintings meant to endure untouched for millennia, or were they always intended as transient gestures, knowing that one day only traces would remain, leaving future generations to wonder what was once spoken clearly in stone? If so much of what survives is shaped by accident, by mineral flow, by rising seas, by erosion and neglect, then there are places where survival feels almost deliberate, as though the stone itself chose what to reveal and what to conceal. In certain regions of North America, rock art panels appear in positions so precarious, so exposed, that their endurance across centuries seems improbable. Along the sheer granite faces of Lake Superior, the red ochre figures of Agawa rock pictographs cling just above the waterline. Painted by Anishinaabe artists centuries ago, the images include canoes, thunderbirds, horned serpents, and human forms rendered in fluid strokes. The lake below shifts constantly. Storms lash the cliffs. Ice forms and breaks each winter. And yet the pigment persists. Ethnographic records describe some of these pictographs as connected to vision quests, spiritual encounters that required solitude and exposure to elemental forces. The cliff face itself becomes both canvas and participant. To approach the site requires navigating slippery rock surfaces, often accessible only when the lake is calm. There is vulnerability embedded in this placement. The images were not hidden deep underground. They were painted at the threshold between land and water, where visibility depends on weather and season. Thunderbirds in Anishinaabe cosmology represent powerful sky beings associated with storms and transformation. The horned serpent, often depicted below, embodies underworld or water-associated power. The juxtaposition mirrors cosmological layering, sky above, water below, human in between. Yet modern viewers often remark on the intensity of the thunderbird's gaze, the sweeping arcs of wings, the sense of motion captured in stillness. The figures feel alive in a way that transcends their age. There is no evidence that these pictographs conceal knowledge of lost epochs or suppressed civilizations. They align with documented indigenous cosmologies and oral traditions. But even within those frameworks, certain details remain interpretively open. Some motifs recur across distant sites separated by hundreds of miles. Shared symbolic vocabulary suggests networks of exchange and communication long before European contact. Networks can dissolve. By the 17th century, epidemics introduced through colonial contact had devastated many indigenous populations across the continent. Archaeological and historical records confirm demographic collapse in numerous regions. Entire communities were reduced drastically within decades. The rock art predates these epidemics, yet their impact on cultural continuity is undeniable. Oral traditions, while resilient, were forced to adapt under extreme pressure. Ceremonial specialists were lost, languages diminished. When a community's demographic structure shifts abruptly, knowledge transmission strains. The images at Agawa Rock endure storms and ice, but the social worlds that animated them have transformed profoundly. Further west, in British Columbia's Fraser Canyon, pictographs painted along steep canyon walls also depict thunderbirds, salmon, and human figures. Some are accessible only by boat. Archaeologists and indigenous knowledge keepers collaborate to interpret these sites, emphasizing continuity rather than mystery. Still, certain figures appear isolated, anthropomorphs with elongated limbs and minimal facial detail, positioned in narrow crevices. Why such precarious placement? One possibility is that the act of painting itself was a ritual requiring physical challenge. To climb or balance along a cliff face could mirror spiritual ascent or descent. In the American Southwest, some pictographs are located high above canyon floors, requiring ladders or climbing to reach. Archaeologists have documented wooden ladder fragments preserved in dry caves, indicating deliberate effort to access elevated panels. Effort suggests intention beyond casual marking. The unsettling quality of some images may arise from their relationship to risk. To create them required vulnerability, exposure to height, darkness, isolation. In modern conservation, safety railings and controlled access mediate that vulnerability. Visitors view from secure vantage points. The original physical intensity diminishes, and yet, even mediated, certain panels evoke quiet unease. The thunderbird's wingspan stretches across stone as if mid-flight. The horned serpent curves with latent motion. Perhaps disturbance arises not from hidden catastrophe, but from the recognition of scale. These images speak to cosmologies in which human life was one layer within a larger animate universe. Thunder, water, animal migrations, all imbued with agency. Modern secular frameworks often flatten such animacy into metaphor. But for the artists, these beings were not decorative abstractions, they were participants in reality. When epidemics and colonization reshaped indigenous societies, those cosmologies did not vanish, but they were forced to adapt within new political and social constraints. Rock art became historical artifact as much as living expression. There is no secret archive withholding the full meaning of these figures. There is historical trauma that complicated continuity. And perhaps that is unsettling in its own way, that profound symbolic systems can endure physically while their social scaffolding weakens. Along Lake Superior's edge, waves continue to lap beneath thunderbirds and serpents. Tourists photograph. Scholars analyze pigment composition. Indigenous ceremonies still occur in nearby communities. Continuity and rupture coexist. In that coexistence lies complexity rather than conspiracy. The cliff face holds red forms that have outlasted storms, epidemics, and modern curiosity. They endure not as relics of a hidden civilization, but as witnesses to transformation. And as wind sweeps across granite and water reflects shifting sky, a quiet question surfaces with the rhythm of waves. Were these paintings meant to anchor communities through upheaval, or to remind future generations that even the most enduring symbols must weather forces beyond human control, leaving behind only traces of a world view once held with certainty. If the cliffs above Lake Superior endure wind and ice, then there are other landscapes where the endurance feels more precarious, where pigment clings to stone in regions defined by fire, drought, and seismic tremor. In the interior of California, at the edge of the Carrizo Plain, a sandstone formation known as Painted Rock shelters layered pictographs attributed primarily to the Chumash people. The rock rises from open grassland, hollowed into a shallow cavern whose ceiling is dense with concentric circles, lattices, starbursts, and anthropomorphic forms painted in red, black and white. Early 20th century researchers speculated that these motifs recorded astronomical events, supernovae, eclipses, cometary apparitions. Later scholarship, drawing on Chumash oral traditions, shifted toward interpretations centered on vision quests and ritual specialists known as antap. Ethnographic accounts describe initiatory experiences in which participants encountered powerful beings through fasting and isolation. Certain geometric forms painted on cave ceilings may correspond to entoptic patterns experienced during trance states. Modern pigment analysis confirms that the colours derive from mineral sources, iron oxides, manganese, possibly charcoal binders. Some layers have been dated to within the last millennium, though precise chronologies remain debated. What is clear is that Painted Rock was revisited repeatedly, its surfaces refreshed and augmented over generations. The disturbance some visitors report at Painted Rock does not arise from monstrous figures or skeletal forms. It emerges from density. The ceiling is saturated with pattern, as though the interior of the rock were mapped with constellations not found in the sky. Human figures appear interwoven with geometric webs. In certain panels, a central anthropomorph radiates lines outward like a solar burst. Is it a star, a shaman, a metaphor for emergence? Scholars resist definitive claims. There is no evidence that the Chumash recorded extraterrestrial contact or apocalyptic celestial impacts. Astronomical interpretations remain cautious, grounded in correlation rather than sensationalism. Yet even within careful analysis, acknowledgement persists that celestial events, comets, eclipses, supernovae, were observed and integrated into mythic frameworks across many cultures. If the sky changed dramatically in visible ways, it would not have gone unnoticed. In 1054 CE, a supernova bright enough to be seen in daylight was recorded by Chinese astronomers and possibly referenced in rock art in the American Southwest, though such interpretations remain debated. Some researchers have proposed that certain crescent and star motifs in New Mexico correspond to that event. Others argue that such symbols are too ambiguous to confirm. Ambiguity remains the constant companion of rock art interpretation. Further north, in Nevada's Black Rock Desert, petroglyphs at Grapevine Canyon cluster along volcanic outcrops. Anthropomorphs with raised arms, spiral motifs, and abstract grids cover dark basalt surfaces. Some figures appear enclosed within rectangular frames as though compartmentalized. Archaeologists have documented the superimposition of newer carvings over older ones. This layering suggests that sites retained significance across cultural phases, even as stylistic conventions evolved. Environmental data from the region indicate fluctuating lake levels throughout the Holocene. Communities adapted to changing shorelines and resource availability. There is no evidence of abrupt civilizational collapse, but adaptation required reorientation. In such contexts, symbolic expression may intensify, not as prophecy, but as orientation. What unsettles is not evidence of hidden catastrophe, but the recognition that entire cosmologies could pivot around environmental cues now barely perceptible. In parts of Arizona and New Mexico, archaeoastronomers have documented light and shadow effects at certain rock art panels during solstices and equinoxes. Sunlight passing through narrow apertures illuminates specific carvings on precise days. These alignments suggest deliberate placement, integrating art with celestial cycles. If some of the most abstract and disturbing motifs were linked to solar events, then the paintings functioned as calendars, anchors of temporal order. Yet solar cycles also carry implicit fragility. A single eclipse can darken midday. A drought following missed rains can destabilize harvests. Perhaps the images encode both reassurance and warning. Colonial disruption later fractured the ceremonial continuity that once animated these panels. Spanish missions suppressed indigenous ritual practice in California beginning in the 18th century. Many Chumash communities experienced forced relocation and cultural upheaval. While traditions survived and continue in revitalized forms today, the rupture was profound. The rock art remained, but its social matrix shifted. There is no evidence that colonial authorities systematically erased painted rock. In fact, early explorers documented it with curiosity, but documentation without comprehension can feel hollow. When ritual becomes ethnographic data, something subtle changes. The painted ceiling at Painted Rock continues to draw researchers, artists, and visitors, and some report a sensation of immersion, of standing beneath a map of invisible forces. That sensation may reflect neurological response to dense pattern and enclosed space, or it may echo the intentional design of ancient artists who understood that certain environments amplify perception. Disturbance need not arise from grotesque imagery. It can emerge from intensity, pattern upon pattern, line upon line, until ordinary orientation dissolves. In a world accustomed to straight lines and digital clarity, the layered complexity of painted rock feels disorienting, and perhaps disorientation was the point. To enter the rock shelter was to step outside daily routine, into a chamber where sky, earth, and human perception intersected. If entire ceremonies unfolded beneath that painted ceiling, guided by chant and rhythm, then the images were not static art but active participants in ritual. Over centuries, as social worlds transformed, the ceiling remained. Its pigments fade gradually, even under conservation efforts. Microbial growth and moisture threaten long-term preservation. Protection measures attempt to stabilize what time inevitably erodes. Preservation can delay, not prevent, and so the patterns persist, neither fully deciphered nor entirely silent. They do not confirm hidden empires or cosmic cataclysms. They confirm human engagement with forces, celestial, environmental, psychological, that exceed individual scale. As sunlight filters through the shelter's opening and shifts across red spirals and radiating forms, a quiet uncertainty lingers in the air. Were these images meant to map the heavens, to navigate inner vision, or to steady communities through cycles of change? And if their original instructions have thinned with time, what does it mean for those who stand beneath them now, searching for orientation in patterns that once spoke with unmistakable clarity? If the painted ceilings of California suggest immersion in pattern, then there are other sites where the rock seems almost stripped bare, where images are sparse, isolated, and yet charged with an intensity that feels disproportionate to their number. Sometimes a single figure, placed with deliberate precision, unsettles more than 100 layered motifs. In southern Utah, along the San Juan River corridor, the towering anthropomorphs of Horseshoe Canyon, often associated with the Barrier Canyon style, reappear in quieter alcoves beyond the better-known Great Gallery. Here, solitary figures stand apart from dense compositions. Some lack arms entirely. Others taper into the rock as if dissolving at the base. Their eyes are large, hollowed by dark pigment that still clings despite millennia of erosion. Archaeologists date much of this style to between 2000 BCE and 400 BCE, placing it within the late Archaic period. These communities were mobile hunter-gatherers, navigating a landscape already shaped by shifting climate and fluctuating river systems. There is no evidence of monumental architecture or hierarchical states, and yet the figures they left behind possess monumentality in their own way. What disturbs is scale without narrative. A single 8-foot anthropomorph dominates a sandstone wall with no accompanying explanation, No hunting scene, no visible ceremony, just presence. Some scholars interpret these beings as spirit entities encountered in trance. Others propose that they represent mythic ancestors or clan symbols. Still others emphasize caution, reminding readers that interpretation through modern psychological frameworks risks distortion. The canyon offers no confirmation. Further west in Nevada's White River Narrows, petroglyphs attributed to the Fremont and earlier archaic cultures line narrow passages of volcanic tuff. Many are geometric, zigzags, grids, concentric circles, but among them appear human-like forms with disproportionately small heads and elongated torsos, sometimes framed within rectangular outlines. The repetition of rectangular framing across multiple regions has intrigued researchers. Some suggest these frames symbolize doorways or portals. Others argue they are simply stylistic conventions. There is no consensus. Yet when a figure stands enclosed within a carved rectangle, the visual implication is difficult to ignore. Confinement, protection, threshold. Environmental data indicate that the Great Basin experienced cycles of drought throughout the late Holocene. Communities adapted by shifting mobility patterns. There is no archaeological evidence of sudden annihilation, yet sustained environmental stress reshapes belief systems subtly over time. Symbols may intensify when resources waver. In central Texas, at Seminole Canyon State Park, the Fate Bell Shelter preserves Pecos River-style murals with anthropomorphic figures flanked by serpents and deer. Some figures appear to bleed from arrow wounds, others are adorned with intricate patterns across their torsos. Carolyn Boyd's research proposes that these murals encode complex creation narratives tied to mythic journeys between cosmic layers. Her interpretations are grounded in comparative mythology and careful analysis of recurring motifs. Yet even within scholarly framing, certain details resist comfortable resolution. Some figures appear partially erased, whether by time or by intentional overpainting. Superimposition suggests reinterpretation across generations. When later artists paint over earlier imagery, do they erase or renew? Superimposition complicates linear reading. A mural may contain centuries of revision. Revision implies memory and motion. In parts of the American Southwest, archaeologists have documented instances where rock art panels were intentionally defaced in historic times, often by settlers unaware of their cultural significance. Bullet marks and graffiti scar surfaces once held sacred. Damage alters perception. A pierced anthropomorph may once have symbolized ritual transformation. After vandalism, the wound becomes literal. Loss accumulates layers. There is no coordinated force systematically erasing these images across the continent. Instead, erosion, neglect, misunderstanding, and modernization each leave subtle marks. And yet, standing before a solitary barrier canyon figure in a quiet alcove, one senses that something more than environmental adaptation was at stake in its creation. Why invest time and pigment into rendering a being so ambiguous? Why emphasize hollow eyes, elongated torsos, and absence of limbs? Perhaps because ambiguity itself held power. In liminal societies, communities navigating thresholds between ecological states or social structures, symbols that resist fixed interpretation may function as flexible anchors. The human mind seeks faces. It seeks narrative coherence. When confronted with a figure that offers neither, it lingers. Neuroscientific research shows that ambiguous stimuli engage the brain longer than easily categorized images. Ancient artists may not have articulated this in scientific terms, but they may have understood intuitively that ambiguity sustains attention. Sustained attention can be ritualized. If these solitary figures were focal points for meditation, initiation, or communal reflection, then their minimalism may have been deliberate. The absence of detail invites projection. Over centuries, projection accumulates. Descendant communities may reinterpret ancestral images within evolving cosmological frameworks. Archaeologists may overlay comparative models. Visitors may impose contemporary fears or fascinations. The figure remains unchanged. What disturbs is not necessarily what it depicts, but the openness it demands from the viewer. In a world saturated with information, ambiguity unsettles. Perhaps ancient communities embrace that unsettlement as a pathway to insight. Or perhaps the figures mark moments when certainty itself felt fragile. The sandstone walls of Horseshoe Canyon absorb heat by day and release it slowly at dusk. The solitary anthropomorph stands unchanged, neither welcoming nor rejecting interpretation. It does not confirm hidden cataclysms or suppressed histories. It testifies to human investment in symbol during times whose full context is thinned. And as shadows lengthen across the canyon floor, a quiet question presses gently against the edges of thought. Were these isolated beings meant to guard knowledge too fluid for fixed explanation? Or to remind those who stood before them that meaning, like the desert river, shifts course over time, leaving behind forms that endure long after their original currents have moved on? If ambiguity itself can become a kind of threshold, then there are moments in the archaeological record where the threshold feels almost tangible, where something seems to have shifted not gradually but perceptibly. Not a vanished empire, not a hidden cataclysm, but a reorientation subtle enough to escape dramatic headlines, and yet profound enough to leave marks in stone. In the American Southwest, the late 13th century brought one of the most studied transitions in North American prehistory. Tree ring data reveal extended drought across the Four Corners region. Settlements in places like Mesa Verde were gradually abandoned. Populations migrated south and east. Archaeologists emphasize migration and adaptation rather than collapse, yet the material record shows decisive change. Rock art from this transitional period reflects that shift. In parts of what is now New Mexico, petroglyph panels at Petroglyph National Monument display imagery attributed to ancestral Puebloan and later groups. Earlier panels include abstract motifs and stylized anthropomorphs. Later carvings introduce Spanish crosses, livestock, and horses, clear markers of post-contact reality. On a single basalt boulder, centuries compress into layered symbols. A spiral carved long before European arrival sits beside a cross incised after missionaries entered the region. The stone record's encounter can be violent or gradual. It can alter cosmology or reinforce it. In some cases, indigenous communities integrated new symbols into existing frameworks. In others, tension sharpened. The disturbing element in certain panels from this era lies in juxtaposition. A traditional anthropomorph stands beside a mounted figure bearing unfamiliar tools. A serpent motif curls beneath a Christian cross. These are not hidden messages. They are historical palimpsests. Yet within this layering, something subtle emerges. The awareness that symbolic systems can be overlaid without fully merging. The spiral retains its ancient resonance. The cross carries its own cosmological weight. The two coexist uneasily. Further east, in the southeastern United States, Mississippian iconography persisted in mound complexes until European contact introduced new diseases and political pressures. At sites like Etowah Indian mounds, engraved shell gorgets and copper plates depict birdmen, serpents, and warrior figures tied to a rich cosmological network. Rock art associated with this southeastern ceremonial complex often portrays mythic beings engaged in transformation or combat. After contact, however, many ceremonial centres were abandoned. Archaeological evidence suggests demographic decline linked to epidemics, rather than organised suppression of iconography. When communities shrink rapidly, ritual continuity falters. The images remain, but their performative context thins. Some 19th century observers misinterpreted indigenous rock art as evidence of lost Old World explorers or mysterious vanished races. These speculations reflect colonial bias more than archaeological fact. modern scholarship has firmly established the indigenous origins of North American rock art traditions, grounded in continuity of material culture and oral history. And yet, even stripped of colonial misinterpretation, the panels evoke something deeper, the fragility of continuity under pressure. There is no singular reset event documented in North American archaeology that erased a sophisticated technological civilization. Stone tools evolve gradually into agriculture, trade networks expand and contract, social hierarchies shift. The record shows adaptation rather than abrupt disappearance. Still, adaptation can feel like rupture from within. Imagine standing in a canyon that once echoed with familiar ceremonies, only to find migration necessary for survival. The rock art remains behind, watching a community depart. Abandonment leaves stone as witness. In certain canyons of Arizona, panels attributed to the Hohokam culture include figures with elaborate headdresses and geometric grids. After prolonged drought in the 15th century, many Hohokam settlements were deserted. The causes remain debated: climate stress, social upheaval, resource management challenges. The petroglyphs do not narrate departure, they simply persist. Perhaps the most unsettling aspect of these sites is not evidence of hidden catastrophe, but the recognition that civilizations can shift course without dramatic annihilation. A migration here, a drought there, a generation lost to disease, each change incremental, yet collectively transformative. Rock art, fixed in stone, becomes a marker of what was once central. Over centuries, new communities reinterpret or ignore older symbols. Meaning becomes layered rather than erased. Colonial expansion accelerated this layering. Missionaries condemned certain ceremonies. Settlers carved their own names into panels. Conservation laws later attempted to preserve what remained. The result is a landscape of symbols bearing scars of encounter. And yet, within this complex history, many indigenous communities maintain living connections to rock art sites. Ceremonies continue, oral traditions adapt, meaning persists in evolving form. The idea of a hidden force systematically rewriting history dissolves under scrutiny. The forces at work were ecological, epidemiological, political, documented and human. But documentation does not soften the emotional impact of standing before a panel where ancient spirals and post-contact crosses coexist. It reveals the reality that symbolic worlds can overlap without fully reconciling. In that overlap lies disturbance, not of monsters or lost empires, but of continuity itself. The basalt boulders at Petroglyph National Monument absorb sunlight as they have for centuries. Spirals carved in pre-contact times curve beside colonial marks. Neither disappears, neither fully subsumes the other, and as dusk settles over the volcanic escarpment, a final question rises gently from the stone. If civilizations do not collapse in singular cataclysms but shift through accumulations of change, then what do these layered images truly record? Warnings of forces beyond control, or quiet acknowledgements that every worldview, no matter how coherent, must eventually share space with another, leaving behind traces that future generations will struggle to reconcile?